Now let's look at error reporting in PHP. And there's two ways to control error reporting. You can either control it in your PHP configuration, or you can override whatever settings you have in your configuration inside of your PHP program. So the first way is by going to XAMPP control, and you'll see there's a config button next to Apache. And one of the options here is PHP.ini. So you can navigate to this in Windows Explorer or the Finder, or you can just go to this button. And then search for error handling and logging. And there's a section in PHP.ini that controls error reporting. So a couple of things to know about. At the very top of the file here, you'll see second page or so. Here are the bitwise operators that PHP.ini knows about. And or, not, and, those are the three important ones that you need to know about for this next bit. But basically, in your configuration file, you can take masks, which are bits that are set that control individual reporting features, and you can combine them using or, and not. So let's go back to error handling and logging, and let's look at what some of those masks are. So there's basically three categories of masks. There are errors, like E under error, and those are fatal errors. So if you hit an E under error, it will crash your program and execution will stop at that point, and anything that you have from that point on will get executed. Then you have warnings, which are things that cause messages to come out, but they're not fatal. So for example, if you try to divide by 0, you get a warning, but your program continues. And then there are things that are called notices, which are basically advisory messages. So if you get a notice, that will tell you that, for example, you're using an uninitialized value, that kind of thing. Then within those groups, errors, warnings, and notices, there are various places in the process where you can generate one of those messages. So for example, you can get an error when you're trying to start up PHP. For example, you're passing too much data into it and there's not enough memory, and so PHP dies during the startup process. Or you can get an error when PHP is trying to compile your code. You can get a parse error or a compiler error. Or you can get an error during execution. Or you can get an error because you've put in code that deliberately causes an error. So you can generate user errors here as well. So all of these different kinds of errors can be reported on individually. So for example, you could choose to just have compiler errors listed and nothing else, or you could choose to have nothing at all, or you could choose to have everything, or you could have some combination. So let's look at the standard settings. So some common values are EALL to report everything, EALL and not notice. So that's all error messages except for notices. All error messages except for notices, and except for warnings about strict. Or here's another example, compiler errors or recoverable errors or core errors. That shows only the errors. And then there are some default values as well. So the default value out of the box is that right there. So it shows all errors except notices, except strict, and except deprecated. So for development, you could use EALL, which is going to tell you everything. But for production, you probably want to shut off most error messages because you don't want errors coming out when the user accesses your website. Particularly since some error messages might have information about values that were passed into the page, which could potentially even include password information or other secure information that you really don't want to have traveling in an unsecured connection. So Here is the first real line of code. Everything above here starts with a semicolon, which is a comment character in your PHP.ini. So this first line of code sets the value of error reporting to all errors except deprecated and except strict. So that's the default setting. And if you wanted to do development and show all errors, you could do that just by changing it to all. Or if you were in a production context and you didn't want to show anything at all, you could just set this to 0. So that's no errors at all. So that's error reporting, and it controls what kinds of errors are reported. You can also control where those errors get reported to. So you basically have two choices. You can report errors on the page when it's loaded, and we've seen some examples of that in this course. Every time we've made a mistake, we've gotten a PHP error right on the page that we loaded. Or you can make errors go to the web server log, which is under PHP error log, right here under logs. Let's take a look at that and see what we have. So, various reports. Or some combination. So let's take a look. So this first directive, display errors, controls whether or not you're going to produce errors at all. So the default setting is display errors on, which means that errors are going to come out on the page. And off shuts reporting of errors off on the page. So you'd want to use that for production, and you'd want to use this for development. The default is on. And then these are the errors that you're going to get during normal page processing, but errors that happen during startup of PHP are controlled separately. And the main time that I've seen this kind of thing happen is when you're, for example, trying to upload a file, and the file you're uploading is larger than the maximum upload limit that you have configured in PHP.ini. So when it goes to start up PHP and pass in the data from the file upload, it blows through the available memory and you get an error on startup. And so you can turn that on or off as well. This is before these errors start occurring. And then you can control whether errors are going to the log. So log errors can be on or off as well. So in the default configuration, errors are both displayed on the page and displayed in the error log. And then if you're displaying stuff to the error log, you might want to control how long the error messages are and how you handle repeated error messages. So if you get the same message over and over again, do you want to log all instances of it or just the first instance? So there are a couple of additional features that you can take a look at that we won't be paying much attention to in this particular class, but I encourage you to read through the log. It can be informative. Not that much stuff here, but controls the location of the log and various things that get reported. Oh, by the way, after you change PHP.ini, don't forget to stop Apache and restart it so that it reloads those settings. But what happens if you're using somebody else's PHP server and it has error reporting turned off or at a different level than you want? Well, you can also control that in your code using the error reporting function. So I can say, for example, error reporting, and then I can give it a constant, which is just the same as the constants we just looked at. So for example, in my PHP.ini, I have all and not strict and not notice and whatever it said. But if I want to report all errors, including deprecated error messages, I can just say all here. And now in the context of this page, any error that I get is going to be reported whether it was set to be reported in my PHP.ini or not. So for example, let's take a look at $x is equal to 1/0. And I'm going to run that without error reporting set to anything. So this is going to be the default setting in PHP.ini. I'll hit reload. And by default, I get this message because it's a warning, division by 0. But what if I set error reporting to 0? So I've essentially turned off all error reporting by doing that. And it works in the other direction as well. So for example, get rid of this. And I'm going to use a deprecated function. So there's a function called connection is equal to MySQL under connect. And I'm going to give it the name of the server and the name, a username, and a password. So this is a default setting. And then I'm going to execute this line of code. So I get a warning division by 0 from before. Let's go ahead and comment that out. But you see I don't get any warnings at all, even though I'm using a function that's deprecated. Well, let's go ahead and change error reporting to EALL and reload. And now I get an error message that MySQL Connect is deprecated with some informational message. So MySQL extension is deprecated, will be removed in the future, use MySQLi or PDO instead. So this can be handy when you're doing development because it's going to report some stuff that you wouldn't normally catch. And you can control it either by configuring your web server or by adding an error reporting line to your PHP code.